do great.
Oh, thank you. Go ahead. Okay. Before we begin, Rick Story is going to lead us in a song. There's a mic over here. Rick.
Oh. I'm loud enough. You think I need one?
Jesus is mine, oh, what a foretaste of glory divine. Here of salvation, purchase of God, born of His Spirit, washed in His blood. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all the day long. This is my story. This is my song, praising my Savior all the day long. Perfect submission, always at rest. I am my Savior, and happy and blessed. Watching and waiting, looking above, filled with His goodness, lost in His love. And this is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all the day long. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all the day long.
In the event that you have not been with us before, this is our series on Judges. We will be finishing that up in 2 more lessons. I'm going to do just a bit of a review to put things into perspective. I want you to know that I have struggled diligently and anxiously about how to proceed with these chapters 17, 18, and 19. This is X-rated material, and I don't want to put us in an embarrassing situation, but on the other hand, we must come to terms with how things were and how things are. The book of Judges covered about 400 years, 1,400 years before Christ. We are now 2,000 years plus, so this is 3,500 years ago, and the behavior that we will see demonstrated today, especially in chapters 18 and 19, mirrors what we see today. Solomon said there's nothing new under the sun. Now, I also have struggled with how to present this material, and I have decided, right or wrong, I decided rather than just read these texts, I'm going to paraphrase them in the hope that I can hold down just a little bit of the anxiety that we go through as we cover this material. Several scholars whose material I read said this period of the Judges is the lowest part in terms of morality in the entire Bible. So this, and we'll look at a slide. The Bible Project, you will recall, has a slide that just covers the entire book of Judges. It's broken down into 3 different sections, and we have now finished. I'll get to this slide in a minute, but this portion here, we shift from individual judges over to how things were in terms of personal life, and we cover 2 or 3 of those. And I will make an attempt, though I don't have the map everywhere I need it this time, I'll attempt to point out where these things take place. So we shift into a demonstration of even further decline. Whoops, one too far. And then we have several individual stories, as I mentioned. So what? I took a class in public speaking when I was a freshman in college, and one of the books, little book about this thick that I still treasure and use, and the book was titled Public Speakers as Listeners Like It. And one of the questions that you want to raise as you're making a speech, who cares? Why are we doing this? What are you talking about? So what? Why should we care about the lives of those characters who lived 3,500 years ago before Christ? Why is it included in the canon of the Bible? What difference does it make? I think the problem probably is with this. So Judges teaches us what? Judges teaches us that it helps to know God. Judges teaches us while the judges were flawed individuals, they were also people of God who operated with great faith. God uses the flawed individuals to do great things that can only be accomplished by the power of God himself, vis-a-vis Gideon. He starts out with 22,000 people, and God winnows those by different processes down to 300. And it was well more than 100,000 people whose army they were fighting against. God wanted to be dead sure that nobody said, we did this on our own. So the book also instructs God's people in what is acceptable to God, and the Judges reveals who people are when they are left to their own devices. And finally, the book looks forward to the coming of a righteous king who will lead God's people in proper worship for him. Now, Ryan mentioned today in his sermon that we had the Mosaic contract, we had the Davidic contract, and then as Christ comes. And so I'm thinking this comment here is twofold. One, we're looking for the coming of the kings that served afterward, and also the coming of Christ. Now, the main theme of the book of Judges, this is material we've covered already, but I want to be sure that we have a place to hang this so that we have a set of perspectives. So Yahweh's sovereignty and the importance of being loyal to him and his laws is above all. That's what God said in the Decalogue in Exodus 20, thou shalt have no other gods before me. Now, I didn't understand for a long time what that meant, but in the condition of the people of the time of Israel in the Judges, they were dependent for their livelihood on agriculture. You didn't grow a crop, you didn't eat. And the vicissitudes of an arid country like that, not knowing when it's going to rain, not knowing when the winds are going to come or when the locusts are going to come, they wanted to hedge their bets. And so they believed in God, but they also saw these other fertility gods like Baal and the Ashtaroth, the main ones. They thought that could help them as well. They were fertility. So God just couldn't. God says, "I am a jealous God. I'm not going to tolerate these other kinds of behaviors." So, the outline of the book of Judges falls into three. One, the prologue, chapters 1-3 through 6, chapters 1 through 3, verse 6, and then the main body when we studied all of these individuals, and then we come now to Ryan was having trouble with this morning, and I think it's pressure on the button that gets the job done. Forgive me. All right. And the epilogue, which is where we are now, is the rest of it. Now, I mentioned to you that the book of Judges has these three parts. So on the left-hand side, you have the introduction, you have the Canaanites with whom they're dwelling. In chapters 3 through 16 are all of these different judges that we've talked about, and Nelson and Chip have both covered them so very, very well. And so now then, we are in the third section. And if you look, you see up here a fellow named Micah, and you see a place named Dan and a place named Lachish. And in those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Now, this theme right here is repeated over and over and over, and it's at the head of each of our chapters today. That's the beginning verse. Now, if you look at this part down here, it says very disturbing, and then that is a paste over towards sexual abuse, violence, and civil war. And all of these things happen. Chapter 20 and 21 wind up where they are in a position of just about to break into civil war. And we'll get to why that happens. Just want to take a quick look at some of the things that you'll recall quickly as we get to them. So we, left to our own devices, are going to do whatever we think is right. And Ryan talked this morning about your vote is generally cast to support whatever it is our own personal interests are. So when man follows his own instincts, ruin results. Adam and Eve to eat the forbidden fruit, Joseph's brothers to sell him into slavery, Nadab and Abihu, sons of Eli, of Aaron, to offer strange fire to the Lord in the tabernacle, and David and Bathsheba to cover, and then their behavior to cover up with murder, and Judas to betray Jesus. Oops, too far. I'm dead in the water if I can't use these slides. All right. At this point, they came to the promised land, and God said to them, you need to take all of this. And what they wound up not doing was moving into and driving all the people out as they were supposed to do. So the 12 tribes were assigned to this part here. God commanded them to fully take the land and to drive out the inhabitants thereof. After Joshua's death, from a lack of clear leadership, the will to follow God's instructions faded. The Israelites began to make relationships with the inhabitants and even marry. Now, I'm afraid to push this button, but down in where the dark green is the country of Dan. That's where the tribe of Dan was assigned. And they didn't, because it was hill country and they weren't all that strong as warriors, they didn't do a good job of driving the people out. And so they wind up a little bit later needing to go somewhere else, and they wind up going up to the north. We'll talk about that place. And they renamed that city up at the top Dan. And you will recall when there was a discussion that covered the whole land, they talk about from Dan to Beersheba. Dan was at the top, and Beersheba was down at the bottom. So these marriages result in the turning away from God and from God's people and the gods of their mates. So this is a central map. You'll notice on the right is the Dead Sea, and Jerusalem is not far. And right smack in the middle of that is a place called Tel Beth Shemesh. And you will recall that in 2019, Dale Manor, who was a a professor of archaeology at Harding, came here and did a weekend for us on archaeology. And Tel Beth Shemesh is where he worked, and that was part of the time of the kingdom of Saul, and those places. So this is a second map. Now you'll notice here that this is changed, and if you look up at the very top, you'll see the tribe of Dan has moved up here, and we'll cover that in our chapters today. So if you look over here, when we get to the text, we'll see Ephraim, the purple one, and Benjamin and Judah. Those will be part of our discussion today. And I want to keep in mind that Nelson said to us not long ago that if you think about Middle Tennessee and Alabama and Kentucky, Israel went from Paducah to Cullman. Is that right, Nelson? And then from Dixon to Lebanon. Now that's the geography of that. We tend to think in bigger terms. So these are the places where we will be talking about today. So Israel's tragic and repetitious fall, and they served Baals and the Ashtaroth, the gods of Syria, Sidon, Moab, Ammonites, and the Philistines. The end of this is where the rest of the Judges is. This describes the lives of everyday people in Israel. God's original intent was for himself to be the king. He meant for them to provide leadership through the Decalogue, that is the Ten Commandments. But the people of Israel mostly did what seemed best to them. This is both a statement of Israel's politics and a condemnation of their rebellious spirituality. So in summary, Judges 17 through 21, entire nation of Israel falls into idolatry one more time. They are involved in armed robbery, sexual assault, murder, genocide, and human trafficking. Where are we? This is today. We hear on the news every day about people being trafficked, young women being sold into sexual slavery. So 3,500 years and mankind hasn't changed. So, and this is a slide I used once before, but the test that God, you remember when we began the book of Judges, it said that these things happened in order to test the Israelites, test results, and their daughters they took to themselves for wives, and their own daughters they gave to their sons, and they served their gods. You'll also recall that Solomon had all of these concubines and all of these wives, adding up to 1,000, and they led him away from God. So Judges 17 begins, Micah's idolatry is a twist in faith. Now, this reflects the danger of moral and religious relativism. Micah lost the essence of true worship by making up the rules. It's not enough to worship according to your conscience, and it's crucial to worship God in truth as He has commanded us. Now, this is a summary. We'll get to. So this fellow Micah in Ephraim steals some of his mother's money. She has 1,100 shekels, and we are told that 10 shekels was a year's worth of salary. And he steals her money, and then he confesses to having stolen this. And some of the people whose work I read said this was a self-serving confession to him, and that his mother had placed a curse on whoever had done it. He finally admitted that he'd done that, and so he said, "I'm going to return this money to you," and she blesses him, and then she takes 20% of the silver and hires a silversmith to make a graven image. So they get the idol made. With the returned silver, she commissions a silversmith, and they carve an image and an ephod. Now, the ephod is you'll recall that those were discussed in the tabernacle, and it was a garment that the priests wore. So they made these two things. They're starting their own religion here. It's what they're doing. So it is clear that their understanding of the Lord's command against idolatry has been distorted dramatically. So verses 5 and 6, Micah makes this shrine in his house, and he sets it up with not only this graven image. He believes in God, but he's hedging his bets, and so he sets up his own shrine, makes the ephod and a household god, and he ordains a personal priest. Now, what happens is the Levites, you will recall, did not have a specific place they were assigned to. They could live anywhere, and so this Levite wants to leave the land of the Ephraimite place, and he goes sojourning around and comes to this fellow Micah's house, and so finds out he's a priest, and so he says, well, why don't you just be my priest? And he tells him how much he'll pay him. He gives him, he's going to give him a stipend. He's going to feed him. He's going to give him a house and buy clothes for him. And so he's got a good deal. And Micah thinks, well, this is not the Micah of the minor prophets. He thinks, well, God's going to bless me here. I've taken care of these people. So he mixes true worship with false practices. And then the Levite becomes Micah's priest, as we've discussed. He comes to Micah's house. Micah offers him wages, and Micah, thinking God will now bless him because he's misunderstanding worship. So Judges 17 takes us to a more personal narrative with the broader context of Israelite struggle to follow God's laws. And this chapter presents the story of Micah, the Ephraimite. That's the land we talked about, the purple land on the map, along with his mother, who they participate in idol worship. Man. So the tribe of Dan sends, now you come to Judges 18, and the tribe of Dan, down in this part of land here where they think they need more, they say, we got to find some more land. So they send out 5 scouts to find a place where to settle. And so they come to this, the Danites come along, and they meet Micah's priest. And so the scouts stop at his house and meet his priest, and they ask him to inquire of their Lord if they'll be successful. And he says, yeah, God's going to bless what you're doing. And so the Danites steal the articles and the ephod from Micah, and the Danites return. Then Micah says, what are you doing here? And so they come back with 600 men, and they wound up attacking this town of Lachish, and they slaughter the peaceful Sidonians there, and then they burn the city and rebuild it. Now, we talk about today war crimes. You go to war and say, well, you're going to fight by these rules. These guys were all in. Think about that. They come to this town, they spy out this town, and they find out that the Sidonians are living in this place. This is up north where the Phoenicians are. They're living there. They're peaceful. They don't have any enemies. And so the Danites come in and they burn the city. They kill all the people, and they rebuild it, and they just take over. So they renamed the city Dan and established a center of false worship. Now you'll recall in the New Testament there are talks about where we worship, and this is one of those which is a problem. So the chapter highlights the themes of misguided zeal, idolatry, the consequences of moral and spiritual drift in community, and then you come to the summary of Judges 19, and the Levite and his concubine. Now, this is where this gets X-rated, and I'm struggling with it. So you'll recall last time I spoke, we had a discussion about concubines, and in those days, people were able to take additional women they were sometimes considered to be a lesser wife, but they didn't have all the privileges and standing in terms of household power that the wife did. So they were part servant and part sexual partner. And so this Levite takes a concubine. Now, I guess we would say, what is a Levite doing taking a concubine? But under those circumstances, God seemed to permit this. So his concubine is unfaithful to him, but the text doesn't say what that means. Did she have sexual relationships with somebody else? Or did she decide she didn't like what we were doing? Anyway, she goes back to her father's house. This is one of the most disturbing chapters in the entire Bible. It is violence and moral decay. So the Levite, after 4 months, decides he's going to go to her father's house and persuade her to come back with him. So he goes and he speaks kindly to her. In those days, there was strong expectations for hospitality. So the Levite's father-in-law says to him, you need to stay. You need to stay here and let me feed you and let me take care of you for a little while. So that goes on, instead from one day it moves into most of a week. And by the time the last day, and the Levite wants to go back home, the last day, they don't leave to start back to where their home is until late in the day. They can't make it in a day. So they come to a town in between there and where they're going, which is Bethlehem. And they say, well, nobody takes them in. They can't find an inn. And so they say, okay, we're going to sleep the night in a city square. An old gentleman comes along, and there's inhospitality, injustice, and there's a society that's turned away from God. So this is where they are at this point now. So these are the points that I want you to pick up from what we're about to see. So they stay in Bethlehem, and they're started back home, and she was ready to return to her father's house. We've talked about it after 4 months. And so they journeyed toward Ephraim to Gibeah. Father tries to prolong the stay. They're late leaving. They get to Gibeah of Private Benjamin, and they say nobody's going to let them in. They're going to stay the night there. And an old gentleman comes along and says, you just cannot stay in a square. You just cannot do that. I will take care of all your needs. And they say, we have all the supplies we need. And so he warns them of the dangers. These are the things that I want you to learn from this. So the men of Gibeah come to the house knowing that they have guests, strangers in the town, and they say, we want you to give us these men so we may have sex with them. Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot's family. And the old gentleman says, we're not going to do this. And they just keep beating on the door. And so finally the old gentleman says, I have a daughter who is a virgin. I will give her to you. That's not satisfactory. They still want the man. Finally, the Levite says, here, take my concubine. Now, I want to go back to Jephthah. I learned this from Scott Huff. After the lesson on Jephthah, You will recall that Jephthah had made this vow that if God gave him victory, whoever came out to meet him or whatever came out to meet him at the end, he would sacrifice to God. And all of the problems, all the opportunities that came along, Jephthah never did say, I have messed up, preserve my daughter and let me be the sacrifice. So the Levite doesn't say, I'll go and be abused. He sends his concubine out. And these men rape and sodomize her all night long. And it's multiple partners. That's as far as I can go in describing that. Let your imagination take you on beyond that. This is just beyond humanity. Instead, they violate his concubine all night. In the morning, they finally let her go. In the morning, he finds her at the door. And I have a couple of pictures that were drawn, paintings that were made by medieval painters, neither one of which I thought would be appropriate to show here. So he says to her, she's at the door, and one of the pictures has her hand out on the threshold for the door, and he says, get up, let's go. And she doesn't respond. And he finally figures out that she's dead. Well, who wouldn't be? So he gathers her up, puts her on his donkey, and takes her home. And he cuts her into 12 pieces. And he sends each of those pieces to each tribe of Israel. Now, what happens next will be discussed by Nelson next week, but we wind up in almost in a civil war. So Israel will rally to punish those responsible. Benjamin refuses to hand over the guilty. A civil war nearly obliterates Benjamin. So we are at the lowest point in the Bible, and these 3 chapters were among the most difficult for me to assemble something that I thought I could say in public. I am 10 minutes short of the goal. I'm willing to take questions. Otherwise, we will be dismissed. Bruce, Nelson, anybody? Question? Okay, thank you very much for being here. We're dismissed.